Hi everybody, my name is Alina and I'm a scientist that specializes in public health research and epidemiology. I'm here today to talk to you about science. More specifically, today's topic is how to be savvy about science in the news. I hope you can stick around. Ready? Let's go. So picture this. You're scrolling through your social media and you see a flashy news article. Something like, scientists discover eating chocolate every day will extend your life. Great. That's science I can get behind. But wait, the very next day, you're scrolling through your timeline again and you see a news article that states the exact opposite, that eating chocolate every day shortens your lifespan. At this point, you're probably thinking, why are these people contradicting each other? And which scientist should I believe? Will I ever eat chocolate again? Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about how science is done, how it is reported in the media, and how you can be a smart science news consumer. So let's start with talking about what science is and how it's done. What is peer-reviewed science anyway? Quite simply put, peer-reviewed science is how we do science. It works like this. A group of scientists run their study using the scientific method. Then they write up a scientific technical snorefest called a journal article or a scientific paper, which communicates exactly what they did in that study in great detail. The paper is written in such a way that other scientists in the field can later take that information and replicate that study. Then the scientists submit that paper to a scientific journal in the hopes of being published in their field. That's how we advance science. Every scientific journal centers on a specific field of study and has its own standards for reporting and for sciencing in their respective field. To make sure those standards are maintained, the journal will share the study with a group of scientists in that field. They put the peer in peer review. The peer scientists evaluate the study and decide whether or not it should be published in that scientific journal. If the study passes all the tests and all the revisions are accepted, it gets published. Congratulations, you've done a science. Something to keep in mind as we talk about this today. Not all scientific journals are created equally. Some have much higher standards than others. And that being said, not all scientific studies are created equally either. But that's like a whole nother video. Now let's talk about how that science gets reported in the media. Well, why? Because for most of us, that's how we get most of our science news. And guess what? A lot of what's reported in the science is not revisited. So if something is debunked, no one really comes back to the media and says, you know what? Nah, just kidding. In addition to that, a lot of science comes up with null results. All that means is that at the end of the study, the scientist didn't find anything significant. Now, a lot of null results are very important information, but they don't make for very catchy headlines. Now, in the science journalism world, there's a thing called single study reporting, and it's a problem. The scientific process is slow and rigorous, and it can take many rounds of studies to build up a scientific finding as fact. One study in itself isn't enough to make something a scientific fact. In order to get that, science has to be replicated by other groups of scientists in that field to make sure the concept is solid. Good science has hundreds or even thousands of studies that all look at the same things and report roughly the same results. It's literally why we do science, to gain that consensus. Replication of studies is how we prove results were real and didn't happen by chance or by accident. Now, we could go down the rabbit hole and discuss how replication studies are rarely funded, But again, that's a whole nother video. The point is, even when science journalism is done very well, single studies are not representative of how science works. So, should we ignore single studies? Well, no. Single studies are how we advance the frontier of science by making new discoveries. But the important thing is, for us, to keep in mind how the new findings fit into the larger picture of a scientific field. And I have to put it out there that bad reporting is not always the fault of a reporter. Scientists are excellent at writing technically. However, they may have problems communicating their findings in a media-friendly way that suits the 24/7 news cycle, in a way that doesn't gloss over the nuances of their science. I wanted to talk about science news consumerism, as it can actually influence what science is done in the future. Having an original finding in a field is preferable, as shocking results bring in clicks and likes and therefore money. Publish or perish is still a thing. Scientists get positions and funding based on their publications. So, what does this all mean? Well, it means that our systems of reporting science to the public cherry-pick studies that aren't necessarily representative of a field of study. That means that we have to be better science consumers. We have to be responsible and learn to decide if a study or the reporting on that study is good or bad. But don't worry, I'm here to help. I've reviewed my notes, I've perused the interwebs, and I've listened to what some of the more popular science communicators are saying. And I've come up with a list of 7 tips for being savvy about science journalism. Now, a little caveat here. It isn't an exhaustive list. There are many strategies one could use. The ones I mentioned today are the ones I find the most helpful and the ones I see discussed the most often. Okay, here we go. My top 7 tips for being savvy about science news. Tip number 1, who's the source? Who wrote the news article about the scientific discovery? That's important to consider, as the author is the filter through which the science is being communicated. What media publication is the news article in? Some publications have political leanings, and some are just better than others. What is the scientific consensus about the topic of study? And what is the author arguing? And keep in mind that a peer-reviewed journal is better than an organization at reporting results. And an organization is better than a seller, like a pharmaceutical company, at reporting results. And as I've mentioned before, not all peer-reviewed journals are created equally. Some have higher standards than others. Tip number 2, always click the embedded links. Do the work, especially if you're going to comment on something online. Oftentimes, the links in an article will take you right to the scientific paper itself, or really good supporting information. If there aren't any links in that article, go to Google Scholar, type in the name of the scientist or the peer-reviewed journal they're listed in. Check it out. Have a look at the citations listed in the article. Is the journalist reporting the data or facts correctly? Sometimes publications and authors will cherry-pick bits and pieces of studies to support what they want the science to say, not what it really says. Consider their comparisons. Are they comparing apples to oranges? Tip number 3, who else is talking in the article? Always look at who else is mentioned in the article. Good science journalism includes not just the scientists who did the research, but also those outside of that research team, but who are also experts in that field. For example, I as an epidemiologist would not ever endeavor to comment on a paper about astrophysics. It's not my jam. And remember, not all scientists and doctors are experts in every single scientific field. It's also important to look at if the author is giving a fair and balanced point of view. How much time is that author giving to a different point of view? Are both sides equal? And should they be? As Neil deGrasse Tyson so poignantly states, It is not honoring journalistic duty to give equal column space to a point of view that completely goes against the larger scientific consensus. That can be very dangerous, and journalists need to know where to draw that line and look at how much scientific agreement there has been given to an issue. A really good example of that is climate change science. 97% of climate change scientists, and we're talking about hundreds or even thousands of research groups, have consensus that climate change is happening and that mankind is implicated in that. However, oftentimes, the other 3% of scientists who are climate deniers are given the same amount of column space. Is that fair and balanced scientific reporting? No! So stop doing that. Tip number 4, don't be taken in by the flashy bits. I'm talking fancy graphics, shocking headlines, and jargon. Headlines and graphics aren't always created by the author of an article, so approach them with caution. The headlines and graphics are created to be clickbait, to grab your attention, to persuade you quickly, and are supposed to be easy to digest. Unfortunately, with how complicated science is, the nuances are often left out, and therefore, these things aren't very good ways of explaining science. And remember, jargon can be intimidating. So consider, is the jargon appropriate to that topic? Is it being used correctly? Are they stretching it to make sweeping conclusions? Miles Bess, an excellent host from Above the Noise, suggests looking for terms and phrases like cure, this study proves, breakthrough, or a new study shows. If you see those words and phrases, he says chances are they're hyping the science. I agree. Tip number 5, the Gish Gallop. The Gish Gallop is a debate technique where one debater will try and overwhelm their opponent with as many arguments as possible with zero care as to whether or not those arguments are inaccurate, invalid, or weak. The point of the technique is that it would take you forever to parse through all that information and determine whether or not those facts were true. Therefore, don't be impressed by the sheer volume of information coming at you in an article. Remember, quality, not quantity. Tip number 6, look at the bones of the study. Does the author mention how large the study is? Generally speaking, a larger number of participants or samples in a study means more robust statistics. All that means is that if the study finds something, it's more statistically significant. Does the author mention what stage of research the study is in for things like new drug treatment or vaccines? And does the author mention if this is a new concept or if it's challenging some pre-existing concept in the field? Are funding sources listed? Who stands to gain from this research or lose? Let's talk about that. Tip number 7, consider the stakeholders. Ask yourself, who are the people impacted by this study? Knowledge translation and knowledge sharing is how scientists communicate their findings to the world, not just in their scientific spheres, but also outside of that arena, to the general public. This is a hot topic, and quite often it's not done very well. Think about this. Are the results being used in the way they were intended? Were they well intended? Do they paint a certain group of people in a negative light? Or could those results be misconstrued that way, either intentionally or unintentionally? And one other thing to consider is who is left out of that research. So that's it. Those are my 7 tips to improve your science journalism BS detector. If you have any good strategies that work for you that I didn't mention today, please mention them in the comments below. If you have any science topics that you'd like me to cover in the future, share them below. If you like this content, please consider supporting it by hitting the like button, subscribing, and clicking on the bell. Until next time, my friends, stay safe out there, please be kind to one another, and I hope you have a stellar day. Bye!